On the night that should have been the warmest of the year, I witnessed the coldest cruelty. My daughter was shivering in the snow. Her husband's family was mocking her by the fireplace. In that moment, I stopped being a mother. I became a warrior. I walked in there and ended their hypocritical play. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment with the city you're in. I want this story to spread as a warning. Never, ever mess with a mother's love. Part 1: The Cold Truth. My name is Helen Reed. At 62 years old, I've learned that the greatest joys are often the quietest ones. A good book, the smell of rain on dry pavement, the low hum of a familiar song on the radio. For years, my greatest joy had been the sound of my daughter's voice over the phone. But that joy had grown quieter lately, fainter. This Christmas, I wanted to hear it up close, so I booked a ticket to Connecticut without telling her. I pictured her surprise, the way her eyes would light up, the way they used to. I imagined a warm hug, the scent of cinnamon and pine in her perfect, beautiful house, a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. The taxi dropped me off at the end of their long, snow-dusted driveway. Up ahead, the Hayes house glowed against the deep blue of the coming night. Every window was a perfect square of golden light. It looked like a Christmas card. It looked warm, safe. I walked up the stone path, my boots making a soft, crunching sound in the fresh snow. Through the large picture window, I could see them. Richard Hayes, her father-in-law, was holding a glass of champagne, telling a story that made the others laugh. His wife, Catherine, sat perfectly poised in an armchair by the roaring fire. A porcelain doll of a woman, Ethan, my daughter's husband, was laughing with them. His sister, Jessica, was there too, flicking her long hair over her shoulder. A perfect family, framed by the window, warmed by the fire. But Sophie was not in the picture. A feeling, cold and sharp, pricked at the back of my neck. I told myself she was in the kitchen, but I walked around the side of the house anyway, toward the back. The wind cut sharp against my face, and that's when I saw her. On the stone terrace, huddled in a wicker chair, was my daughter. She was wearing a thin silk party dress. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her shoulders shaking violently, not from sobbing, from the cold. The wind wasn't just cold, it was cruel. It had teeth, and it was biting at my daughter's bare skin. She didn't have a blanket. She didn't have a scarf. She was just there. As I stood there, frozen in disbelief, I heard a fresh wave of laughter from inside. It was Richard's voice, booming and clear through the glass. If a little winter breeze makes her shake like that, he laughed. I'm afraid my son made a poor choice. The laughter that followed was warm and cruel. It wrapped around the house and seemed to mock the silent, shivering girl on the terrace. I felt something snap deep inside my chest. The quiet, hopeful part of a mother that always believes her child is safe. It just broke. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I walked back to the front door, each step deliberate. My heart wasn't pounding. It was beating with a slow, cold rhythm, the rhythm of a coming storm. I pressed the doorbell. Ethan opened it, a surprised smile on his face. Helen, what are you? I didn't answer him. I walked past him, my wet boots leaving dark prints on the polished hardwood floor. I walked straight through the grand entryway and into the living room. The conversation stopped. Catherine Hayes looked up, her smile as thin as a razor's edge. Well, Helen, what an unexpected arrival. Her eyes flickered toward the terrace door for a split second. She knew. She knew exactly where Sophie was. I ignored her. I walked to the glass door, slid one open, and stepped out into the biting cold. Sophie, I said. She lifted her head. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. A tiny, broken sound escaped her throat. Mom. I took off my heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her small, trembling body. I took her hands in mine. They were like blocks of ice. As I helped her stand, another ripple of laughter came from the living room. She's always so dramatic, I heard Catherine say, her voice dripping with amusement, just seeking attention. I led Sophie back inside, into the suffocating warmth of that perfect room. I stood her in the center of the expensive Persian rug, my arm holding her steady. She kept her head down, hidden in the collar of my coat. I looked at their smiling, comfortable faces. I looked at the glittering tree, the sparkling wine, and the fire crackling merrily in the hearth. They weren't just leaving her out in the cold. They were warming their hands on her misery. I felt the quiet snap inside me turn into a slow, burning rage. Every laugh from this room, I said, my voice low and steady, was another cut into my daughter. You call this a family? Richard scoffed into his glass. It's the Hayes family. Perhaps she simply isn't strong enough for it. I looked from his arrogant face to Catherine's cold, perfect one. I looked at my son-in-law, who couldn't even meet my eyes. And I knew this was more than just one cruel night. This was their way of life. I pulled Sophie closer to my side. Tonight, I said, each word a piece of ice. Your party is over. The first cracks. The drive back to my small apartment that night was silent. Sophie huddled in the passenger seat, wrapped in my coat, staring out at the falling snow. She looked like a child again, small and lost. I didn't press her. I just drove. The steady rhythm of the windshield wipers marking time. Each swipe of the blade felt like it was trying to wipe away the scene I had just witnessed, but it couldn't. The image of their smiling faces around that warm fire was burned into my mind, and the whole way, a single thought echoed in my head. A painful, heavy thought. I should have seen it. I should have known. The frost didn't appear overnight. It had been creeping in for years, in tiny, almost invisible ways. I think back to the beginning. Back when Sophie first brought Ethan home, she was so full of light then. Her laughter was a melody that filled every room. She was studying art history. But her real passion was baking. She dreamed of opening a small bakery one day. A place that smelled of sugar and butter and fresh bread. She was so alive. Ethan seemed perfect. He was handsome, polite. And he looked at my daughter as if she were the only person in the world. He came from a world so different from ours. The Hayes family, old money. Their name was etched onto library wings and the brass plates of museum benches. When Sophie told me they wanted to meet me, I was nervous for her, but she was just happy. The first time I had dinner at their house, I felt like I had stepped into another world. The dining room was vast. With a table so long, I felt like I needed binoculars to see Richard at the other end. Everything gleamed. The silverware, the crystal, the polished wood floor. Catherine Hayes was the picture of elegance. She wore a simple pearl necklace that probably cost more than my car. She was gracious, charming. She complimented my work. A contract negotiator, she said, her voice smooth and measured. How fascinating. It's truly wonderful that a woman can be so assertive in a man's world. She paused, then glanced at Sophie with a soft smile. Our Sophie? She's much more of a sensitive soul. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. I thought she was acknowledging my daughter's gentle nature. Now, I hear the words differently. I hear the subtle line she drew between us, between strong and weak, between a woman who does and a woman who feels. I should have seen it then. The first little crack in the perfect facade. A few months later, for Catherine's birthday, Sophie spent weeks working on a gift. It was an apron, made of beautiful linen. Down the front, she had embroidered tiny, detailed wildflowers. It was a piece of art, a piece of her heart. When she gave it to Catherine, her face was glowing with pride. Catherine smiled that perfect, polished smile. Oh, Sophie, darling, it's lovely. You are so clever with your hands. She folded it carefully and set it aside. Later that evening, I went to find the guest bathroom. I opened a door I thought was the restroom, but it was a small utility closet. And there, tucked behind a vacuum cleaner and a bucket of cleaning supplies, was the apron. It was tossed in a corner, already looking forgotten, like a piece of trash. My heart sank, but when I found Catherine in the hallway a moment later, she just smiled and said, "I'm putting it somewhere safe. Helen, it's too precious to risk getting dirty." Again, I accepted her words. I wanted to believe them. For Sophie's sake, the final warning sign, the one I can never forgive myself for ignoring, came about a year after they were married. Sophie was finally putting her dream onto paper. She had a whole binder filled with plans for her bakery, recipes, budget forecasts, sketches of the storefront. She was electric with excitement. She brought it to a Sunday brunch at the Hayes house, hoping to get their support, perhaps even a small investment from her father-in-law. She laid the papers out on the coffee table in the sunroom, her voice full of passion as she explained her vision. I was so proud of her. I saw the girl I raised, full of fire and ambition. Catherine was listening, nodding, her smile never wavering. She reached for her glass of red wine, which was sitting, I now realize, precariously close to the edge of the table. Her hand moved, a graceful, deliberate motion. The glass tipped, red wine spilled across Sophie's business plan. A dark, bleeding stain that soaked into the pages. Sophie gasped. The color drained from her face. "Oh, my goodness," Catherine exclaimed, her hand flying to her mouth in mock horror. She looked at Sophie, her eyes wide with feigned apology. "I am so terribly clumsy. Forgive me." "Dear," she paused, looking down at the ruined papers. Then she added, her voice soft as velvet, "But you see, darling, sometimes paper dreams are just so fragile." I remember the look in Sophie's eyes. The light in them just went out, and I did nothing. I helped her clean up the mess. I told her it was just an accident. I told her she could print the pages again, but I knew, deep down, it wasn't an accident. It was a message, a carefully delivered execution of a dream, and I let it happen. The death of dreams. The first time Sophie lost a baby, my world tilted on its axis. I was in Chicago for a conference. I remember standing in a sterile hotel room, the phone pressed hard against my ear, listening to my daughter's grief pour out in ragged sobs. All I wanted was to hold her, to absorb some of her pain into myself, but I was 500 miles away. Ethan got on the line eventually. His voice was tired, but reassuring. "We'll get through this, Helen," he said. "She's strong. We're both here for her." By we, he meant himself and his mother, and that was the beginning of it. The beginning of the slow, careful theft of my daughter's spirit. Catherine Hayes turned Sophie's grief into a project. She was always there, at their house, with a casserole dish or a sympathetic smile. She redecorated Sophie's art studio, replacing the vibrant colors with muted, calming shades of gray. "To help you rest, darling," she'd said. She told Sophie's friends that Sophie needed space, that she was too fragile for visitors. Slowly, quietly, she began building the walls of a cage around my daughter, and she called it care. The second time it happened, about a year later, the phone call was different. Sophie didn't sob. Her voice was flat, empty. It scared me more than the tears. "Catherine says it's probably for the best," Sophie told me, her voice a monotone. "She says my body is trying to tell me something, that maybe I'm not meant for motherhood." I felt a cold fury rise in my chest. "Sophie, that is a cruel thing to say. That is not true." "Is it?" she asked, and there was a genuine note of confusion in her voice. "She says I'm too emotional, too sensitive." Ethan agrees. He says we should focus on other things. The business plan for her bakery sat on her desk, gathering dust. The bright, hopeful pages were now just another reminder of a life she was being told she wasn't strong enough to live. They had taken her grief and twisted it into a weapon against her. They made her believe her sorrow was a sickness, a weakness. I should have gotten on a plane right then. I see that now. But my own work was demanding. And Ethan was so convincing on the phone. "We're handling it, Helen." "We have it under control. We're even getting her professional help." The professional help was a therapist, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, a close friend of the Hayes family. I found that out later. After a few sessions, he diagnosed Sophie with severe depression and paranoid tendencies. It was all so neat, so clean. They had a doctor's note now, a label to stick on her. It wasn't their cruelty that was breaking her. It was her own mind. The phone call that haunts me the most came on a Tuesday night. It was late. I was already in bed. The phone rang, and I saw Sophie's name. I answered immediately. Mom. Her voice was a terrified whisper, so quiet I could barely hear her. Sophie, sweetheart. What's wrong? There was a long pause. I could hear her shallow, ragged breathing. I think she's happy when I'm in pain, she whispered. Today, when I was crying, I saw it in her eyes. A look like she was pleased. My blood ran cold. Who have not rated? Sophie, who are you talking about? Catherine, she breathed. And then I heard a man's voice in the background. Ethan's. Who are you talking to? Sophie's tone changed instantly. It became bright. False. Oh, nothing. Mom, I'm just tired. Really. Everything's fine. Before I could say another word, she hung up. I sat there in the dark, clutching the phone. I called back. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called Ethan. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with annoyance. Helen. It's late, he said. Sophie's just having one of her bad nights. The doctor warned us this might happen. It's best to just let her be. Let her be. They were words of abandonment disguised as medical advice. They had isolated her so completely that even her own mother's concern was now part of the problem. Have you ever listened to a loved one and felt the scream trapped behind their silence? That silence can be the loudest sound in the world. If my story touches you, if you've ever heard that silent scream, let me know in the comments below. I read every one, because every story shared is a burden lessened. The air in that room was thick, heavy with things unsaid. The scent of pine from the towering Christmas tree and expensive perfume couldn't mask the metallic smell of fear. My daughter, Sophie, was a ghost in my coat, shivering not from the cold anymore, but from the sheer weight of their stares. For years, I made a living by controlling the temperature in rooms like this, rooms full of tension, where every word was a weapon and every silence was a negotiation. In my old life, I called this controlling the atmosphere. I had retired from that life. But the skills, they don't leave you. They just lie dormant, waiting for a reason to wake up. Tonight, they had a reason. Ethan was the first to break the silence. His voice flustered, a nervous flutter in his throat. Helen, really, we should all just sit down. Let's talk about this calmly. Sophie, she gets overwhelmed. You know how she is. He was looking at his mother as he spoke. Not at me. Not at his wife. He was a puppet looking for his strings. Looking for his script. I didn't let him find it. My gaze moved past him, settling on his father. Richard Hayes was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, as if it were a judge's bench. He looked powerful, important, a man accustomed to being the final word in every room he entered. Mr. Hayes, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the sudden stillness, it felt like a shout. He looked at me. His eyes narrowed slightly. You were a judge for over 30 years. He nodded slowly, a flicker of professional pride in his eyes, feeling he was back on solid ground. That's correct. Then you must be very familiar with legal terms. I continued, my tone level, almost conversational. I have a question for you. Professional curiosity, tell me, what is the definition of reckless endangerment? The silence that followed was heavy enough to press the air from your lungs. Richard's face tightened. The word judge had been a compliment a moment ago. Now, it was a cage, and I had just locked the door. He knew exactly what I was asking. He knew I was putting his entire professional legacy on the line right here in his own living room. The confident posture sagged. Just a fraction. A fine tremor appeared in the hand resting on the marble. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words failing him. For the first time in his life, perhaps, Richard Hayes had no verdict to give. He was a king. And I had just pointed out that his castle was built on sand. I didn't wait for an answer he didn't have. I turned to my son-in-law, to Ethan. He was wringing his hands, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the rug. Ethan, I said, my voice a little softer now, but no less sharp. Your sister, Jessica, is pregnant. I believe congratulations are in order. I saw Jessica flinch in the corner of my eye. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Her hand went to her pregnant belly. A gesture that was both protective and terrified. Ethan nodded weakly, unable to look at me. Yes, she is. That's wonderful news, I said. A true blessing. My eyes stayed on him. Now, imagine for a moment. Ethan, just imagine her husband finds her outside on a freezing night like this one, shaking, unwell, and he leaves her there while he enjoys a party inside. Tell me, Ethan, what would you call that man? What would you do to him? He didn't just pale, he seemed to shrink, to collapse inward. He looked at Jessica, whose face was a storm of unreadable emotions. Then back at the floor, as if it held all the answers he didn't possess. He was trapped between the man he was supposed to be and the man he had just proven himself to be. His silence was a confession, echoing louder than any shout could. And through it all, Catherine Hayes watched. She hadn't moved a muscle. She sat in her armchair, a queen on her throne, observing the dismantling of her husband and son with an unnerving, icy calm. Her face was a perfect, unreadable mask. She didn't sip her wine. She didn't adjust her dress. She was utterly still, a statue of control. But I saw it in her eyes, a flicker of surprise, a flicker of respect. No, not respect. It was the detached curiosity of one predator recognizing another. I finally turned my full attention to her, the source of the frost, the architect of this quiet, cold hell. All these years, Catherine, I said, walking slowly toward her, my footsteps silent on the thick rug. The world seemed to shrink, the room falling away until it was just the two of us. All this effort, this perfect house, this perfect family, this perfect performance. I stopped just a few feet from her chair, close enough to see the tiny hairline cracks in her foundation. I looked directly into her cold, empty eyes. Are you happy? The question was a stone dropped into a frozen lake. It was too simple, too direct. It was a question her perfect world had no defense against. For a single, breathtaking moment, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. I saw a glimpse of the vast, echoing emptiness behind her eyes, a void of carefully managed disappointments and buried dreams. Then it was gone. It was like watching a sculptor frantically trying to patch a crack in a marble statue. She composed herself, lifted her chin, and gave me that same serene, empty smile. She said nothing. That was the only answer I needed. Come, Sophie, I said. Turning to my daughter without looking away from Catherine, I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me. A fragile weight. We started for the door. The Hayes family just stood there, frozen, defeated. They were no longer a family. They were portraits in a gallery of sorrow. As we reached the entryway, I paused. I turned back one last time, my gaze finding Catherine's across the silent, ruined room. I didn't need the others to hear this. This was for her. I lowered my voice, speaking just loudly enough for the words to cross the space between us like a thrown dart. You're an expert at controlling your family, Catherine, I said. Let's see how you handle someone you can't control. I saw the serene smile finally vanish from her lips, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. And in that look, I saw the true beginning of a war. Then I turned and walked my daughter out of that cold, perfect house and into the cleansing storm outside. The shelter and the first move. My apartment is not large. It doesn't have polished hardwood or Persian rugs. The furniture is old and comfortable, worn in the places where people have sat and talked for hours. The air smells like books and lemon tea, not potpourri and old money. When I brought Sophie home that night, it was like bringing a wounded bird into a quiet nest. It was a shelter. It was safe. For the first few days, Sophie didn't speak. She barely ate. She would sit on my old sofa, wrapped in a thick quilt my grandmother made, and stare at the wall. Her eyes were vacant, her body still. It was an unnerving silence, a silence full of ghosts. I didn't push her. I just was. I was there. I made her chicken soup, the kind I used to make when she was a little girl with a fever. I'd leave the bowl on the coffee table, sometimes hours later. I'd come back and see that she had taken a few sips. It was a victory. In the evenings, I would sit in the armchair beside her and read aloud from old novels. I didn't know if she was listening, but the sound of my voice seemed to fill the empty spaces in the room, to push back against the silence that had followed her home from that cold, grand house. I'd brush her hair, my fingers gently working through the tangles. Her hair, which used to be so full of life, was dull and brittle, like the rest of her. One night, while I was reading, I felt a small pressure on my hand. I stopped talking. I looked down. Sophie's fingers had curled around mine. It was a faint touch, almost unconscious, but it was there. It was the first sign of life, the first small signal from the person trapped deep inside the shell of my daughter. Hope is a strange thing. It can feel as fragile as a bird's wing and as strong as steel, all at the same time. While my heart was tending to Sophie, my mind was going to war. During the day, while she slept, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and a pen. My old instincts, the ones from my years as a negotiator, were kicking in. I made lists. I drew diagrams. I mapped out the Hayes family like a corporate flowchart, noting their strengths, their weaknesses, their assets. Their greatest asset was their reputation. Their greatest weakness, I suspected, was the truth. I needed a witness. I needed someone who had been inside those perfect walls, someone who had seen what I had only just begun to understand. There was only one person I could think of: Maria. Maria had been the Hayes' housekeeper for nearly 10 years. Sophie had always spoken of her with real warmth. Then, about 6 months ago, she had been fired. Suddenly, Ethan had told Sophie it was because she had broken an expensive vase. It had never sounded right to me. Finding her wasn't easy. The Hayes family had likely made her sign a non-disclosure agreement, but I had my ways. I found her living in a small apartment complex across town. I went to her on a cold Thursday afternoon. She opened the door a crack, her eyes wide with fear when she saw me. "Mrs. Reed," she whispered, trying to close the door. "Maria, please," I said, my voice low and calm. "I am not here to cause trouble. I am here to ask for your help, for Sophie's sake." The name Sophie made her hesitate. She looked past me, down the empty hallway, then slowly opened the door. Her apartment was small but immaculate. We sat at her little kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken fear. She was terrified of the Hayes family, of what they could do. "They are powerful people." "Mrs. Reed," she said, wringing her hands. "I know," I answered, "but they are not invincible." "Maria, why were you really fired?" Tears welled in her eyes. "It was not a vase," she said, her voice trembling. "It was because of what I heard." I leaned forward, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. "What did you hear?" "Maria." She took a deep, shaky breath. "It was a few months ago. Mrs. Hayes was on the phone in the library with one of her friends. She was laughing. I was dusting in the hall. The door was open a little. She was talking about Sophie." Maria paused, looking down at her hands. She said her friend must have asked her if she was worried about Sophie, about her depression. "And Mrs. Hayes, Catherine," she said. "Worried, darling? Of course not. The girl needed to be broken. A wild horse must be broken before it can be tamed." And then she said the words I will never forget. Maria looked up, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of terror and pity. She said, "Once she is broken, my son can build her back up again, in his image, in our image." The opponent's move. I had expected a fight. I had not expected a war. In my old job, negotiations were about facts, figures, and leverage. There were rules, unspoken, perhaps, but they existed. In the war, the Hayes family declared there were no rules, only power. Our lawyer, a kind, determined man named Mr. Davies, filed for divorce on Sophie's behalf, citing emotional distress and neglect. It was a quiet, legal first step. Their response was a cannon blast. It came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier. Inside was a letter from a law firm I had only ever read about in the business pages. A firm with a name that sounded like old money and quiet ruthlessness. The letter was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It spoke of their deep concern for Sophie's fragile mental state. It mentioned her history of emotional instability following her miscarriages. They painted a picture of a loving family trying desperately to help a troubled young woman who was now being unduly influenced by a meddling and overbearing mother. That was me. I was the meddling mother. The words were designed to sting. And they did. But it was the offer at the end that truly took my breath away. They offered a generous settlement, a very generous one, more than enough for Sophie to live comfortably. But there was a condition, a hook hidden inside the bait. In order to receive the money, Sophie would have to sign a document admitting to a history of psychiatric issues and agree to enter a treatment facility chosen by the Hayes family. It wasn't a settlement. It was a cage, a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. They weren't trying to divorce her. They were trying to own her story, to legally brand her as crazy so that nothing she said about them would ever be believed. It was Catherine's signature move, precise, cruel, and designed to leave no mark on the outside. I put the letter down on the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly. For the first time, a cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I had faced powerful people before, but they were corporations, faceless entities. This was different. This was personal. I looked at Sophie, who was watching me from the doorway, and I felt a pang of doubt. Was I strong enough for this? Was I dragging my daughter into a battle that would only break her further? The cannon blasts kept coming. Phone calls started. Friends of Sophie and Ethan's, people we had had over for dinner, they called to say they were worried about her. One woman, whose name was Patricia, told me she had been asked to give a statement. She said she would have to tell the truth. She would have to mention that time Sophie cried at a dinner party. That time Sophie left a charity event early because she wasn't feeling well. She's just so sensitive. Helen, Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Ethan has been a saint, putting up with it all. A saint. I remembered Ethan, staring at the floor while his wife froze outside. Some saint. Each call was a small cut, a paper cut, seemingly insignificant on its own. But together, they were meant to make us bleed out, to exhaust us, to make us feel so utterly alone that we would have no choice but to surrender. And for a while, it worked. The weight of it all was crushing. The apartment, which had been a sanctuary, began to feel like a bunker under siege. I watched Sophie retreat back into her silence. She would sit by the window for hours, just watching the snow fall, her face a blank mask. The spark I had seen in her was gone. Smothered by the relentless assault, the doubt in my heart grew louder. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I should have just taken her away, quietly, and let them have their victory. Then, one evening, I was sitting at the table, going over the lawyer's letter for the 10th time, my head in my hand. I felt a small touch on my shoulder. It was Sophie. She was standing behind me, looking down at the letter. Her eyes, which had been so empty, were now dark with something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Anger. She picked up the letter. She read the words that painted her as unstable, as broken, as a problem to be managed. Her hands shook, but not from weakness. It was from rage. She put the letter down. She looked at me, her gaze clear and steady. They want me to believe I'm crazy, don't they? Mom, she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it was as sharp and solid as a piece of flint. I could only nod. A small, bitter smile touched her lips. Okay, she said. Then let's show them what a crazy woman can do. Ampere's gift from the shadows. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you feel you are slowly losing. It settles deep in your bones. It's a weariness of the soul. After weeks of legal maneuvering, of motions and depositions, that exhaustion had become a constant companion. The Hayes family's lawyers were sharks. They swam in circles, tearing apart every piece of our story, twisting Sophie's pain into a narrative of instability. Maria's testimony was dismissed as the disgruntled words of a fired employee. The therapist's diagnosis was their shield. We had a story. They had a fortress. I remember one afternoon, sitting in our lawyer's office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and defeat. He was a good man. But he was tired too. He looked at us from across his large desk. His shoulders slumped. "Helen. Sophie," he said, his voice gentle. "I have to be honest with you. Without concrete proof. Something more than testimony. This is going to be an uphill battle. A very steep one." In that moment, I felt the last of my strategic resolve begin to crumble. I looked at Sophie. She was staring out the window. Her face pale. She had been so brave. So much stronger than I could have imagined. But I could see the toll it was taking. This fight was forcing her to relive her deepest traumas. Day after day, only to have them denied and reframed as delusion. I thought, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I was dragging her through hell for a victory that would never come. That night, the quiet in my apartment felt different. It felt heavy, like surrender. The next morning, the phone rang. It was our lawyer. But his voice, it had changed. The weariness was gone. In its place was something I couldn't quite decipher, a kind of stunned energy. "Helen," he said, "you need to come to my office. You and Sophie. Right now?" When we arrived, he was standing behind his desk, not sitting. On the polished wood surface was a plain manila envelope, no return address, just his name and the office address, typed. It had been delivered by a courier that morning. "It came an hour ago," he said, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it might be a snake. "I don't know who sent it." He slid it across the desk toward me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the clasp. Inside was a stack of papers, bank statements, brokerage account records, emails printed in stark black and white. I started to read. Sophie came and stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder. The room was utterly silent, except for the soft rustle of paper as I turned each page. It was all there, everything. Statements showing large sums of money being moved from a trust account in Sophie's name, an inheritance from her grandmother, records of high-risk stock purchases, nearly all of them resulting in significant losses, printed emails between Ethan and his mother, Catherine, where she advised him on these investments, urging him to be bold, to take risks to rebuild the family's portfolio. They were using my daughter's inheritance as their personal gambling fund. This wasn't just emotional abuse. This was fraud. This was a crime. It was concrete. It was provable. It was the key. Sophie let out a small, sharp gasp behind me. It wasn't a sound of sorrow. It was a sound of vindication. This was the proof that she wasn't crazy. The unease she had felt for years about their finances. The feeling that something was wrong. It was real. As I gathered the papers, something small and metallic slid off the pile and onto the desk. It was a paperclip, but not a normal one. It was shaped like a dragonfly, with delicate, filigreed wings. I stared at it. A memory flickered in my mind. Hazy at first, then sharp and clear. A family photograph on the mantelpiece in the Hayes living room. A formal event. Jessica, Ethan's sister, was wearing a dark green dress, and pinned to the collar was a brooch, an elegant and silver dragonfly. It couldn't be. Jessica, the same woman who had smirked at Sophie's pain, the one who always looked at my daughter with such disdain. It made no sense. Tucked at the very bottom of the stack was a single sheet of paper with one typed sentence. There was no signature, just the word, "I will not let my daughter have her ending." Our lawyer read it over my shoulder. "Her daughter," he murmured, confused. Jessica's daughter is only 4 years old. I picked up the dragonfly paperclip, its cool metal resting in the palm of my hand. I didn't have an answer. All I had was this unexpected, unbelievable gift from the shadows. This weapon, delivered by a hand I couldn't identify, for reasons I couldn't comprehend. In our darkest moments, sometimes a light appears from a place you could never have imagined. It makes you realize that even in a story filled with pain, there can be quiet acts of compassion, or perhaps of self-preservation. If you are still listening to me here, please leave a number 1 the comments below, just so I know I have companions on this journey. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part of this story. The final move. We didn't go to court. A public trial would have been a spectacle. A bloody fight played out for headlines. That was their arena, not ours. Mr. Davies, armed with the anonymous package, requested a final mediation, a private meeting, a quiet room, my arena. We met at the law offices of their powerful firm, a place designed to intimidate, paneled walls of dark wood, thick carpets that swallowed sound, a conference table so large it felt like a continent between us. They were all there. Richard, Ethan, and Catherine. They walked in radiating confidence, dressed in expensive suits, their faces composed and unreadable. They thought this was their territory. They were wrong. Sophie sat beside me. She wasn't the trembling girl from Christmas Eve. She was quiet, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wore a simple blue dress. She looked them in the eye. Her silence was more powerful than any accusation. Their lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man, began with the same tired script. He talked about Sophie's unfortunate emotional state, about their generous offer, about the pain this was causing the family. I let him finish. I let the silence settle in the room for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then I leaned forward. "We are not here to discuss my daughter's health," I said, my voice calm and low. "We are here to discuss fraud." I nodded to Mr. Davies. He didn't raise his voice. He simply opened a file and began to lay out the documents, one by one. On the polished surface of the table, bank statements, investment records, emails from Ethan to a financial advisor. Each page was a nail in the coffin of their lies. Each page showed money moving from Sophie's inheritance account into high-risk ventures that had failed. Catastrophically, Richard Hayes's face, which had been a mask of bored superiority, began to crumble. He looked at the papers, then at his son. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, the great Judge Hayes was speechless, but my focus wasn't on him. It was on Catherine. She remained perfectly still, her face a blank canvas. She was trying to calculate, to find a new move, a way out. I decided to end the game. I pushed the papers aside. I looked directly at her. It was never about the money, was it? Catherine. She flinched, the first crack in her composure. "This," I said, gesturing to the damning evidence, "is just noise, a symptom of the real sickness." I leaned forward, my voice dropping even lower. "You don't hate my daughter. You couldn't care less about her. What you hate is what she represents." I paused, letting the words sink in. "You hate the bakery she wanted to open. You hate the art she loved. You hate that she had a dream that was entirely her own. Something that had nothing to do with being Mrs. Ethan Hayes. You hate her because she was a reminder of the woman you might have been before you erased yourself to become Mrs. Richard Hayes." Something shattered in her eyes then. The ice cracked. For a single, fleeting second, I saw the woman behind the mask, a woman hollowed out by bitterness and regret. That's when Ethan broke. He had been staring at the table, his face ashen. Now he looked up, not at me, but at his mother. His voice was a choked whisper. "You told me it was a good investment," he said. "You told me she would never know. You said we had to protect the family assets." He shook his head, a look of dawning horror on his face. "You lied to me." He finally turned to Sophie, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic plea. "Sophie." But his mother cut him off. "Ethan," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "Be quiet." But it was too late. The perfect family portrait had been torn to shreds. Mr. Davies slid a new document across the table. It was our settlement agreement. It was not a request. It was a demand. Full repayment of every stolen dollar, with interest. A substantial sum for emotional damages. And a legally binding restraining order. A permanent one. No calls. No letters. No contact. Ever again. Their lawyer picked it up. He read it. He looked at his clients, whose united front had completely collapsed. He looked at the evidence of financial fraud that could not only ruin their reputation, but could also lead to criminal charges. He sighed. A quiet admission of defeat. "My clients will need a moment," he said. We gave them their moment. We stepped out into the hallway. Sophie leaned against the wall. And for the conversation in the park. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came with a gentle persistence that felt like a quiet promise. The snow, which had seemed like a permanent shroud over the world, finally retreated, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. Small, determined green shoots began to push their way through the cold ground. It felt like a reflection of our lives, slow, quiet, a gradual return of color to a world that had been gray for far too long. Several months had passed since that final, sterile meeting in the lawyer's office. The divorce was a sealed document in a file cabinet somewhere. The agreements were signed. The silence from the Hayes family was absolute, as if they had simply ceased to exist. Sophie was healing. I learned that healing is not a straight line. It is a spiral. There were good days, days filled with her sketching designs for the bakery she now spoke of, with a firm, quiet hope. The smell of experimental batches of sourdough or cardamom buns would fill my small apartment. A warm, living scent that pushed out the last of the winter chill. And there were bad days. Days when a shadow would pass over her eyes. When a particular song on the radio or a phrase from a movie would send her spiraling back into the silence. But the quiet days were getting fewer, and the silence itself had changed. It was no longer the empty, terrifying void it had been. It was thoughtful. It was the sound of a soul mending itself. It was peace. One bright Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that feels like a gift. We were at the park. It was my idea. I told her she needed to feel the sun on her skin. She had agreed without argument. Another small victory. She was sitting on a wooden bench by the duck pond, her face tilted up to the sky, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She looked present, for the first time in a long time. She looked like she was truly in her own body, in her own moment. I had gone to get us some coffee from a small cart near the playground, wanting to hold on to the simple perfection of the day. As I waited in line, enjoying the warmth of the paper cup in my hand, I heard a child's laughter, a high-pitched, carefree squeal of pure joy. I turned, a smile already on my lips, and then my heart gave a small, tight jolt, the kind of jolt that is part memory, part warning. It was Jessica Hayes. She was pushing her little girl on a swing, her face relaxed in a way I had never seen it. Her daughter, a small, bright thing with dark, tumbling curls, was kicking her legs, trying to fly higher. Jessica was not the woman I remembered from that gilded living room on Christmas Eve. The sharp, brittle arrogance that she wore like armor was gone. In its place was a tired softness, the universal, unguarded look of a mother lost in the simple happiness of her child. She saw me over the top of her daughter's head. Her smile didn't just fade, it was extinguished. For a brief, unguarded moment, I saw a flicker of pure panic in her eyes. The instinct of a cornered animal. She looked as though she might scoop up her daughter and run. I held her gaze for just a second. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I simply nodded. A small, neutral acknowledgement that we were two people occupying the same space. I collected our 2 coffees, the cardboard tray feeling flimsy in my suddenly unsteady hand, and began to walk the long way around the playground, back toward Sophie. I had no desire for a confrontation. That part of our lives was over. Mrs. Reed. Her voice was quiet, without its usual sharp edge. I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. I took a breath, steadying myself. Then, I turned. She had lifted her daughter off the swing and was holding her hand. She walked toward me, her expensive leather boots making no sound on the soft grass. She stopped a few feet away, creating a small, empty space between us. A no-man's land. We stood there for a long moment in a silence that felt louder than the cheerful noise of the playground around us. The children laughing, the rhythmic squeak and groan of the swings, the distant bark of a dog. I see Sophie is looking better, she said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the careful neutrality of a diplomat. She is, I replied, my voice even. She's finding her way back to herself. Jessica looked down at her own daughter, who was now hiding behind her legs, peeking out at me with wide, curious eyes. Jessica smoothed the child's hair, a slow, repetitive gesture that seemed to be for her own comfort as much as for the little girl's. My mother, she said, her voice dropping so low I had to strain to hear it. is an expert at building gilded cages. They are beautiful on the outside. Warm. Safe. But they are still cages. She looked up then, and her eyes, clear and startlingly direct, met mine. For the first time, I saw something in them other than disdain. I saw a deep, settled fear. I will not let my little girl grow up in one of those cages. The dragonfly paperclip, the single-type sentence. The pieces didn't just click into place. They slid into place with the quiet, devastating finality of a lock turning in a heavy door. That's why you sent the documents. I said, it wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact, hanging in the air between us. She gave a small, sharp nod, her chin lifting in a familiar gesture of defiance. Her gaze was unflinching. Don't misunderstand me. Mrs. Reed, she said, her voice firming up. The old, sharp Jessica reappearing for a moment. I didn't do it for your daughter. Sophie was always too soft for my family. She was a lamb in a house of wolves. She was never going to survive. The words were blunt, almost cruel, but they held the cold, ringing echo of truth. I did it for my daughter, she continued, her hand tightening on the little girl's shoulder. A protective, almost possessive gesture, so that one day she won't be the lamb, and maybe. She paused, her eyes drifting away for a second, toward the perfect blue sky. A small part of me did it for myself. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and the anger I had held on to for so long, the hard knot of it in my chest, finally began to dissolve. It didn't vanish in a rush of forgiveness, but slowly unraveled, thread by thread. I saw the expensive clothes, the perfect hair, the life of privilege. But underneath it all, I saw another prisoner of the Hayes name, a different kind of prisoner, one who had been born inside the cage and had learned its rules intimately in order to survive. She had not acted out of kindness. She had not acted out of justice. She had acted out of a fierce, desperate instinct to protect her own blood from the poison she knew so well. She had seen her own daughter's future in Sophie's past, and she had chosen to burn down a part of her own house to ensure her child had a chance at escape. There was nothing more to say. There would be no apologies offered, and none would be accepted. There would be no friendship, no absolution. There was only this, a moment of stark, complicated truth between two women, two mothers from different worlds. Standing in the fragile sunlight of a spring afternoon, I thought of the hatred I had felt for her whole family. But looking at her now, with her daughter clutching her leg, all I felt was a deep, weary sadness. A sadness for all the things that are broken in the name of family, in the name of reputation, in the name of a legacy that devours its own. I gave her a single, slow nod. It was an acknowledgement, an understanding that transcended word. It said, I see you. Then I turned and walked away, back toward my daughter, who was waiting for me on the bench, her face turned toward the warm, healing sun. What remains? It has been a year since the day the snow fell, a full circle of seasons. The world has turned, as it always does, and winter has given way to a bright, crisp autumn. I'm sitting at a small table, made of light-colored wood, next to a large window. The sun is streaming in, warming my face. The air smells of cinnamon, melted butter, and coffee. It's the smell of a dream come true, Sophie's dream. This place is called the Rolling Pin. It's a small bakery on a quiet side street. The walls are painted a cheerful yellow. In the display case, croissants and muffins and scones sit like little jewels. There is a low hum of happy chatter, the clinking of cups, laughter. A real, genuine laughter that warms the room better than any fireplace. And there, behind the counter, is my daughter. She is wearing a simple linen apron, a little smudge of flour on her cheek. Her hair is tied back, and her eyes are full of light. She is talking to a customer, an elderly woman, explaining the difference between a brioche and a challah. She is not just selling pastries. She is sharing her passion. She is radiant. She is whole. The scars are still there. I know. They always will be. But they are no longer open wounds. They are thin, silvery lines. Reminders of a battle she survived. A battle she won. I looked down at my hands, resting on the warm ceramic of my coffee mug. For a long time, these hands were fists. They were the hands of a negotiator, a fighter, ready to strike a table for emphasis, ready to protect my child from the world. But now, they are just the hands of a mother, relaxed and open. And in the quiet warmth of this bakery, I've come to understand a few things. I used to think that a parent's greatest job was to build a smooth road for their child, to clear away all the rocks and thorns so their path would be easy. I was wrong. The greatest job a parent has is to give their child a sturdy pair of shoes, one strong enough to walk on any road, no matter how rough, and to always be there, to be the person waiting at the end of that road, not to carry them, but to help them dust themselves off when they fall. I watch Sophie as she moves around her small kingdom. She hands a cookie to a little boy, her smile so natural, so effortless. She has learned the most expensive lesson of all, that her value is not measured by what she can provide for someone else, not a child, not a legacy, not a perfect family name. Her value is simply in who she is. To leave a place where you are not cherished is not an act of failure. It is an act of returning home to yourself. I look out the large window, at the people hurrying by on the sidewalk, their faces buried in their phones. The world outside keeps spinning, full of its own silent battles. We live in a world where beautiful walls hide the deepest cracks, where cruelty no longer carries a sword. It wears designer clothes and speaks in perfectly modulated tone. It's a quieter, more sophisticated kind of evil, but it's just as deadly. But I also learned that the truth, like a stubborn seed, can be buried under layers of cold earth. It can be starved of light and warmth, but it will always find a way to push through to the sun. Sometimes in the most barren and unexpected soil. The small bell above the door jingles, announcing a new customer. Sophie looks up, and her face breaks into that beautiful, brilliant smile. "Welcome to the rolling pin," she says, her voice clear and strong. I take a sip of my coffee. It's rich and warm and just a little bit sweet. And for the first time in a very long time, my heart feels completely, actions face, and peacefully at rest. And so, the story of that cold Christmas night and the long road back to the warmth comes to a close. What do you think of the path Helen chose? And what about Jessica's final, silent act? Would you have done anything differently if you were in their shoes? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly read every single one, and your perspectives give this story a life beyond my own telling. If this story made you think or feel something deep inside, please don't forget to leave a like. Share it with someone who you believe will be moved by it. And subscribe to Dipu Cater Stories so you don't miss the mysteries we uncover next. I will see you in the next story, and who knows, perhaps next time, the story will be about you.